What I love to do is introduce the right people to the right people.
I assemble the smartest people I can think of or reach out to carry that conversation, and that's exactly what I've done today.
Please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome.
Okay, guys, Jay Martin here, CEO of Cambridge House, and I'm joined today by Miles Ruttan, macroeconomic analyst and the co-founder of Bytown Capital. Miles, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm really good, really good. Glad to have you on. I was excited to bring you on the show because I wrote about you in my newsletter like a month and a half ago. And I think, I was trying to recall how we met, right? And I believe you responded to an email, a newsletter that we sent out. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. But you were essentially pitching me on the uranium case. And I said, yeah, sounds good. Tell me why you're so bullish. And you responded with a 4-page report detailing sort of four bullish arguments, one bearish arguments. And I just thought it was really well written. And I was like, who is this guy? So we got in touch and took it from there. Is that right? Is that how we got connected?
Yeah, I figured that it was probably a smart idea to look deep into the uranium sector a while ago. And I thought that you might be interested in having a chat about it. So you're right. Obviously, I wrote something up, and there are a lot more than 4 bullish cases for it, as we might speak on later. But yeah, that's about right.
Okay, so tell us about Bytown Capital, Miles. What do you do? It's you and your partner at Bytown. You guys provide some research reports and manage a bit of money. Is that correct?
Yeah. So basically, kind of like not necessarily like we're kind of one-stop shop, I guess, macro, anything you need. So on a day-to-day basis, I do a lot of trading, focus on commodities and currencies mostly. And, throughout the process of trading commodities and currencies, lots of intricacies, and you kind of just got to be aware of the whole macro landscape. So what we do is just write up research reports, investigate into basically whatever deep questions anyone might have on the macroeconomy, as well as trade some money. And like I said, mostly commodities and currencies is where I personally like to focus.
Okay. No, I'm not going to lie. One of the things that struck me when we first connected was your age, 24 years old. And what struck me about that, Miles, is that I get asked all the time from clients, from personalities I have on the show, how are we going to get the younger generation interested in the commodities market? And my answer used to be, well, if we go back 4 or 5 years, it was a horrible bear market, very tough to generate returns. And my answer is always, people will come when there's money to be made. It's as simple as that, right? Now the market's turned, and my answer has changed because now I look at my YouTube demographics and we're trending younger all the time. So what struck you? I mean, you're a young man to be running a company like Bytown Capital. What struck you, Miles? How did your attention get turned to macroeconomics and finance the way it has?
Yeah, so good question. Obviously, macro is it's a large pond to try to swim in. I guess you could say there's a million different things you can look at in macro, and it's almost impossible to be an expert on all things macro. It's not like some niche accounting specialty or something like that. So what I did is I looked at what was going on in the world. And I used to live in the States, in the Baltimore, DC area. Things didn't seem right. And you could see a huge disparity between the inner city and, the swamp, as some people might call it, or the Capitol Hill. So I looked at what was going on, some of the inequalities in the States. And then in Canada, I had some experience on Parliament Hill here. And it really struck me that the problems that we're facing as a society and as an economy in Canada or the United States, the whole developed world for that matter, it really struck me that there was not necessarily anyone who was prepared to solve the problems. There was no quick fix. And it goes along with something, I believe Thomas Sowell, an African-American economist, a legend for sure, I believe he said that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And that really struck me, especially after living in the States, like I said, and kind of really grappling with political and socioeconomic issues. My personal conclusion was that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And the people in charge don't really seem to be judging which trade-offs are necessary. They don't even really believe, I don't think, that they need to make trade-offs. So I personally decided that it was a good idea to become more independent from their decisions. And that led me to learn a lot about macroeconomics. And now I call myself a macro addict. I believe that's something that I coined by, I guess, George Gammon, but I can really sympathize. Once you get into it, you know you love it as soon as you see it. And I did. And things like, Mike Maloney, Hidden Secrets of Money, really got me deep into monetary policy. And it's just kind of a snowballing effect from there. So, yeah.
And are you seeing a broad awakening, in I guess, population's interest, right? Like a cultural shift in investor sentiment, because, you referenced George Gammon. I love his show. I'm a big fan. And the growth of his channel and his show over the last year has been phenomenal, as with a lot of his peers. So are you seeing like a general awakening, Miles? And if so, what's driving it?
Well, I do think that there's a massive cultural shift going on in all of finance. But it's not necessarily limited to finance. It's actually, in my opinion, a cultural shift going on across all business sectors, all advanced nations. And what I personally believe is more people are waking up to the fact that we've been living in an economy, a global economy, obviously driven mostly by the United States, let's say. So let's look at the United States specifically then for this example, but we have a liquidity-induced risk environment. It's not a natural risk environment across the entire economic spectrum. So what I think is really happening is the cultural shift is that people are waking up to the fact that, central banks have essentially tried to replace solvency issues with unlimited amounts of liquidity. And lots of people today might be arguing potentially that this is something that's happened after extreme actions in 2020 facing the coronavirus crisis. However, the type of malinvestment that comes along with extreme central bank induced liquidity has been or was born more so in 2008, because that's when the Fed first stepped in and gave all the other central banks permission to follow and interfere in unprecedented ways with liquidity. So I think the cultural shift is essentially the average Joe this time around is starting to say, hey, the banks seemed to get a bailout in 2008. We didn't. And now the governments in the United States, for example, they're sending these stimulus checks, and the question, how does it get paid for? It doesn't really have an answer besides, it just gets printed. So I think that's the big cultural shift is people are starting to wake up to the fact that we don't really live in necessarily a capitalist system in the true sense. Mm-hmm. We live in a system with very controlled capitalism. It's some might call crony capitalism. It is very central planner driven, and people are just betting on the ability of the central planners to keep it going, keep it all tied together. So I think that's the big shift, and I think that's also the big danger. Now we have such a massive population of people, and they're not necessarily betting on a company or the stock market in general. I think a lot of people are just betting on the ability of central planners to keep the financial economy glued together. Now that the financial economy is no longer the same or representative whatsoever, really, of the real economy. And so Where does that take us? I mean, I'm not necessarily the guy to ask. A lot of smarter people than me have some interesting insights where we're headed, where the end game is. People including Doug Casey, Jeff Snyder, as we mentioned before, guys like George Gammon. He can explain things in a really good way. And the list goes on and on, but I think that's the big cultural shift. People are waking up to the central bank economy.
Yeah, right. Okay, now I want to pivot to uranium, Miles, because that's where we first connected, and you pitched me quite hard on why I should host a uranium event here on the YouTube channel. You wrote me a fantastic report outlining your bullish case for a sustained uranium bull market. What are you watching right now, Miles, that's contributing to that for you?
Well, there are quite a few things. So I'm sure anyone watching this channel is already quite familiar with the fact that the commodity sector is in a sweet spot, to say the least. So without going too far into the general argument about why commodities are so bullish, let's just say that we all understand why the commodity sector has such a positive outlook. Things like money printing and extreme fiscal spending.
Yeah, most people that watch this channel are in alignment with you on that one.
Yeah, of course. So now, obviously, the uranium sector, to get more specific about that, what's really interesting about it is it's probably the most overlooked commodity sector. In terms of tangible assets, it's maybe one of the most hated since the last bull market ended about a decade ago.
Sure. So
as famous investors such as Jim Rogers, Stan Druckenmiller, they've said it 1,000 times. You want to buy things that are cheap. And I believe Warren Buffett says you should be greedy when other people are fearful. So I think that really describes the uranium sector right now. I think people are a little bit afraid of it. It has a bit of a maybe negative reputation because its association with the weapons industry.
Sure. Okay.
So I think that's why uranium is quite unloved, and that's why people should definitely take a look. And because it has gotten to the point where it's so unloved, the entire uranium market cap, this was last fall, I believe. So just recently, there's been a lot of capital flowing into some of the big and small uranium companies.
Yeah.
So this number might be a little outdated, but in the fall, I know the entire sector was $20 billion.
Right.
Which is a drop in the bucket because you can get a bunch of people on Reddit these days to pump something by, I'm sure, that amount. So $20 billion is nothing when you consider the fact that the uranium sector provides about 20% of the United States electricity.
Right.
So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that. And renewable energy, the other thing is, it's not necessarily the best for base power generation. So we want the electricity grid to always be charged up, essentially, and you want to always just be able to, flick the lights on. You need dense energy sources to run the electrical grid, or productive energy sources. And I'm not a scientist or anything, but I know that there are some issues with renewables in that regard. And if we want to go green, and we also want to be consuming the same amount of energy, we need nuclear. It's quite necessary, in my opinion. And other people have explained this in great detail, such as guys like Rick Rule. Highly recommend looking up some of Rick Rule's interviews regarding the uranium sector. But I find that to be very promising for uranium, that it produces 20% of the United States electricity, 10% of base power, but the entire market's only $20 billion. Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So if we think that we can just keep going about our daily lives and keep the same standard of living, using the same amount of household energy, we're going to need to rely on uranium, and uranium spot price will need to go up. Right now, a lot of producers have been kind of shying away, not necessarily just because of COVID, but also because the price of uranium is just so cheap.
Yeah.
A lot of these producers need $50, $60 uranium to really incentivize them to produce. So uranium's at around, let's call it $30. It's not going to cut it. We need to see uranium at least in the $50 range to make uranium or make nuclear viable. And I believe that we are going to see that. And once we do, these uranium equities are going to be doing pretty well compared to how they've been doing for the last 8-10 years.
I think you're right. And if you look at the market, yeah, you're right. The supply and demand economics are very favorable. But you also pointed out the stigma issue, which shouldn't be ignored, right? People do have an understanding of uranium that's tainted a little bit because of its association with the weapons industry. And then because of disasters, right? Like Fukushima, there's some pretty real fear that's justifiable. So, how do you deal with that, Miles? Any thoughts? Because you gotta get investors bought in to the narrative, right? And there's a education delay there, I believe. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, you're 24. You're part of a generation that's going to take over the world and drive the renewable energy trend, I believe. Any thoughts on how you overcome a stigma like that, Miles?
Yeah, actually. So this goes it has to do with a general macro theme as well, that you really need to pay attention to policy in this environment. So policy is going to either exacerbate a stigma or is going to end a stigma around a certain product, whatever it is, or a certain commodity like uranium. So my generation clearly is in love with renewables. It's not going to change. I think that's here to stay. I think that's fair to say. We're headed towards a green future. It's just a question of how that's going to happen. Some people love good, clean coal, if you want to put it that way. I wouldn't necessarily say coal is the cleanest, but and other people say, hey, it doesn't matter if every single job in the oil industry is gone tomorrow. We need to change our ways. We need to move right towards a Green New Deal. I'm not here to say either policy is right. I'm not here to suggest that you should believe morals are more important than economics or anything like that. But to overcome the stigma in the uranium sector specifically, it's going to rely a lot on policy. And I think that we've seen a lot of important developments, really positive developments, actually. So, for example, in the United States, just recently, a congressional committee announced that they were going to create the strategic reserve for the United States in uranium. I forget the exact name for it, the acronym. But essentially, Congress is saying we need a strategic reserve for uranium. We can't just rely on, let's say, maybe Russian uranium or just foreign in general. We need homegrown, I guess you could say, uranium, or we need Western sourced uranium. And so that's gonna squeeze supply. And then it also just goes to show that the United States Congress has it on their radar. They know that it's important for their green energy goals and for their policy goals more broadly. So not only that, we have places like Japan. You mentioned Fukushima. That was obviously a tragedy. And for the last decade, the uranium sector has been punished. What's positive is that Japan, I believe, has around 20 reactor restarts that they've got planned.
Yeah.
China has recently announced that they're essentially going to be doubling their demand for nuclear energy. And so Japan, China, the United States, there's been some rumblings out of places like Germany, France. I think the winds are changing. I think that the policy preferences are starting to shift in more positive tone towards the uranium sector. And like I said, if you want to solve the green energy issues that we face today, people my age, you want to make a difference, advocate for uranium. And we need that for our base power generation if you really want to go green.
I love it. Okay. Look, Miles, I'm glad we connected. Glad to have you on and introduce you to our audience. I've enjoyed getting to know you in the last couple of months. So it's been really fun having you on. And you've inspired me to charge forward with the Uranium Summit. So we're doing that in a few days here on the channel. February 28th, we're going to be speaking with a couple very, very intelligent energy strategists and uranium investors, along with a couple investment opportunities. Miles, thanks for your time. Let's have you back sometime.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure. I look forward to seeing what everyone has to say. And we'll talk soon.